Good evening, class. This is John, and I'm finally getting around to recording some things that I've been meaning to take care of this afternoon. We left off talking today. We were discussing Congo's almost successful bid for independence, which took place really in 1960. But our purposes for today were to really get a clear sense of where the level of development, the overall level of development, stood within the Congo as independence approached. And as I was starting to make the case in class, there were real concerns about Congo's level of development, not necessarily because the Congolese people were incapable of self-rule, but because the decades and centuries prior to 1960 had really created a number of obstacles to the preconditions that are helpful, maybe not necessary, but that are very helpful for successful self-rule and sovereignty. So I'm going to click through these slides, and of course you can stop at any point if you need to improve your notes, but these are mostly comments that we already touched upon today in class, and we left off today talking about the multinational corporation of the Union Miniere Haut Katanga, which was the most significant mining operation in the Congo in the years leading up to Congo's independence. It will continue to be a factor even afterward, but our purposes here today were to see how much of the economic development of the Congolese society was tied to this primary mode of production. And on this slide, we also are still talking about primary modes of production, and as I mentioned and took a little time in class discussing, agricultural, essentially a natural resource-based economy that essentially harvests crops or harvests timber or mines minerals. This is kind of at the basic, the lowest level of the economic food chain, so to speak. It's part of a balanced economy for sure, but normally pretty simple, pretty straightforward, doesn't require usually a whole lot of education, but can be done, and of course these global commodities are things that the global economy needs, and it's not to put down agriculture. Good farmers are incredibly bright people who have to have a number of different skill sets. So there's nothing about the primary mode of production that is per se basic or simple. It's just that when an entire nation or region's economy is tied to the primary sector or a primary mode of production, it can usually be a harbinger of not necessarily good things. So continuing with the primary mode of production, we have cash crops here. One of the things that the Congo produced were a lot of, in particular, palm oil, which was overseen by a different multinational corporation, the Anglo-Dutch Unilever Company. It had a local subsidiary that did a lot of its palm oil planting, harvesting, and production. But it was essentially a European multinational corporation that was at the heart of the Congo's agriculture. And you'll see here 35 to 40% of the commercial agriculture in the Congo was cash crops. And what we mean by this it's usually a monocultural crop, so it's an emphasis on maybe one or two agricultural products. usually items that are really useful to the global economy. And of course, a cash crop brings with it a little bit of a few related challenges. One of them is that if for some reason there should be a sudden change in the global demand or appetite or need for a grown agricultural product, it can really almost overnight gut or harm the regional economy. By contrast, there are also times when that export can be very valuable and can do quite well. From many of the most recent years in the Walla Walla Valley, wheat has been a really strong export. And so a lot of our local wheat farmers have done fairly well. Of course, it can also swing dramatically in the other direction as well if a economy isn't careful. So these plantations, particularly palm oil plantations, were a significant part of the Congolese landscape. Unfortunately, from a development standpoint, the multinational corporations could pay pretty low wages to the employees in this industry. And at different times, they even resorted to forced labor. And so this is a concern and consideration. When we talk about forced labor, we'd probably be talking about people who were in debt, in sort of debt peonage is sometimes the word used, where they've been lent extended credit and they're behind on their payments, and so their labor is sort of fixed and required simply to pay back the debts that they owe to the company. And so that's considered to be a form of forced labor. Okay, and then closely related, although this is slightly different, but the agricultural economy of the Congo throughout the 20th century is going to exist side by side with a fairly dramatic increase in the urban growth of select cities throughout the Congo. And I've mentioned some of these cities before, like Leopoldville and Stanleyville and Elizabethville. These cities are growing largely due to migrant workers. They, these cities are attracting people because of the work, because of the jobs, and this gives rise to a significant, the urban growth becomes a force or an aspect of Congolese society that needs to be reckoned with. And in some of these cities, largely inhabited by black Congolese citizens who have, in many cases, relocated for the agricultural work. They're going to form associations which, in different cases, in different contexts, will also become political. And so this is part of the story of the developments that are happening in the run-up to the 1960 independence of the Congo. And it's probably worth noting that one of the probably more critical developments of this urban character that's forming, again, largely in response to agricultural developments, is that we're going to now start to see circulating dailies, these newspapers, which are, we don't always think about this, but newspapers are a pretty powerful institution in the sense that they can form people's opinion, they can be a conduit to press reporting, they can create greater inquiry and curiosity by the people about what is going on within their country. And so this is kind of a critical precondition that is going to have some consequences for the ways in which independence unfolds throughout the Congo. So back to education, it's worth noting that throughout much of the Belgian presence in the Congo, education had been limited, but the education that had happened was largely done through churches and oftentimes through the missionaries who were a pretty important part of the cultural landscape of the Congo. Again, this might in some ways bring to mind the, in some, I mean, it's not, I don't want to be too cynical about this point, but in some ways there's a little bit of the white man's burden of trying to shape the African people, African societies in the mold of the European cultural landscape. And so Christianity, of course, is going to be an important part of this, particularly for the missionaries that are there. But this has to do with primary education, but a little more about just religion in general. There's quite a bit of evangelism, as I've said here, and evangelism is essentially religious outreach. An evangelical religion is one that doesn't just practice itself and maintain itself among a core group of believers, but it's seeking to constantly spread and share and convert others to that same faith. And so, missionaries, churches that send missionaries are almost by definition evangelical, because generally speaking, the point of missionaries throughout recent centuries of history has been to convert more people to one's faith. And so here we see on the eve of Congolese independence, 600 priests, 500 ministers, and that is worth noting because in the 1950s, of a total of 16 million Congolese, and incidentally that population is about 5 times that now, but in the 1950s, of the 16 million Congolese, 3.5 million would have been associated with the Catholic portion of the Christian faith, and almost 2 million, 1.75 million, would have been considered Protestant. So lots of missionaries were facilitating this growth of various denominations of the Christian faith throughout both the Congo and beyond. But in the 1950s, there's going to be some changes happening. Part of this is likely due to the investments that are happening in the infrastructure of mining. But we start to see education policies that are coordinated more sort of at the governmental level and not just left to religious institutions and churches of the various missionaries that were found throughout the Congo. But nonetheless, you can imagine this was a change for the Congolese, cultural balance, and many of the missionaries doing work throughout the Congo were not pleased with this turn toward a more secular education system, and so there were instances of missionaries even working with the everyday Congolese people, the natives, to resist this turn away from the Christian schools toward a more secular education system. And I'll just mention, some of you maybe heard of the book The Poisonwood Bible by Barbara Kingsolver. It's a best-selling piece of historical fiction, but she's essentially writing about her childhood as a part of a missionary family in the Congo. And so if you're at all interested, you might want to take it up. You can read further, or at least on related issues through that book. Okay. So in 1957, again, we're talking about precursors of the eventual arrival of independence. There are municipal elections, and these are new. They're kind of an interesting experiment, but they were also pretty low-key, just local elections in the more urban centers of these cities found throughout the Congo, particularly cities like Stanleyville, Leopoldville, and Elizabethville. But what was interesting about this is the Congo in the 1950s, it didn't really have a civil society to speak of. I mean, in many ways, it was just, as I've framed it here, a satellite base of the Western industrial system. I mean, a lot of the infrastructure